Jessica Carter had always imagined a peaceful life in the suburbs, quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and the kind of community that made you feel safe, where children could play outside without a second thought. It was why she and her husband, Daniel, had decided to move to this particular neighborhood. The house was charming, the schools were good, and the green lawn seemed to whisper of a slower, easier way of life. It was perfect. Or so they thought. The first few days had been everything they'd hoped for. The sun was shining, the kids played in the yard, and the hum of normalcy was comforting. However, it didn't take long for Jessica to realize that there was one person in the neighborhood who didn't quite fit the idyllic picture, a woman who seemed to hover on the edge of every conversation and every front yard. Karen Blackwell, the self-appointed HOA president, had greeted them with what seemed like a well-practiced smile, her hand outstretched to welcome them into the neighborhood. Her enthusiasm was polite, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that there was something a little too sharp about her gaze, something that didn't quite match the warmth of her words. At first, Karen's comments seemed harmless. "Lovely house you've got here," she said one morning as Jessica was trimming the bushes, her voice all sugary sweetness. "But you might want to think about trimming those hedges a bit more. It'll save you a headache with the HOA." Jessica nodded, unsure if Karen was offering advice or making a subtle demand. The more she saw of Karen, the more Jessica began to notice the little things, the way Karen would stand by her window and watch their every move, the odd, unsolicited feedback she gave on their lawn care, or the way Sophia, their 13-year-old daughter, interacted with the other children. Karen's overly precise observations about how Sophia played with her friends made Jessica uneasy. It felt controlling. The more she thought about it, the more Jessica began to realize that Karen's seemingly friendly demeanor hid something darker. The real tension started one Saturday morning when Jessica was out in the front yard, watering the flowers. It had been a peaceful morning until Karen appeared, walking with purpose down the sidewalk, her heels clicking against the pavement with a metered rhythm. "Good morning, Jessica," Karen called out, her tone friendly but with an edge of formality. "How are you settling in?" "I'm doing well, thank you," Jessica replied, trying to sound as cheerful as possible. "That's great to hear," Karen said, pausing next to the fence, glancing at their neatly manicured lawn. "Although, you might want to pay attention to the grass along the driveway. The HOA has very specific rules about lawn maintenance, and it's best not to get on their bad side." Jessica stiffened slightly. "We've been taking care of it," she said, trying to brush off Karen's comment. "I'll keep an eye on it." Karen nodded, but there was something in the way her eyes lingered that unsettled Jessica. "Just a friendly reminder," she added, then turned to walk away, her heels tapping loudly on the sidewalk. But before she was out of earshot, she called over her shoulder, "You know, some neighbors get fines if they don't follow the rules. I'm just looking out for you." Jessica stood there for a moment, feeling a tight knot form in her stomach. Karen's words hung in the air long after she had left. Fines? For what? Was this what suburban life was really like, under constant surveillance by someone like Karen? Was she going to have to live under the constant scrutiny of an HOA that felt more like a dictatorship? It wasn't long before the tension reached a boiling point. That afternoon, Sophia and a few neighborhood children were playing a game of tag in the yard, their laughter echoing in the air. It was a warm day, and Jessica was in the kitchen preparing dinner, feeling a rare sense of peace. But that peace was shattered when Sophia rushed into the house, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Mom, Karen's outside," Sophia said, her voice trembling. "She said I was being too loud." "What?" Jessica asked, confused. "What do you mean, too loud?" "She said I was disturbing the neighborhood, and that I need to be quiet." "But Mom, I wasn't even doing anything. I was just playing with my friends." Jessica's heart sank. She moved quickly to the window, and sure enough, Karen was standing in her yard, her arms crossed and her eyes fixed firmly on Sophia. The look on Karen's face was not one of a neighbor giving a polite suggestion, it was the look of someone asserting authority, a command cloaked in the guise of a friendly neighbor. Without a word, Jessica walked outside, her mind racing. As she approached Karen, she could see the older woman's lips tight in a controlled frown. "Karen, what's going on?" Jessica asked, trying to keep her voice calm, though a rising anger simmered beneath her words. "Sophia was just playing with the other kids. It's a warm day, they're having fun. What's the problem?" Karen didn't look at Sophia, she was focused entirely on Jessica now. "I don't think the noise level is appropriate. Children these days need to learn some respect for the rules. If Sophia doesn't understand that, maybe I need to remind her of the community guidelines." Jessica's blood ran cold. Community guidelines? The woman had gone too far. "I'm sure you have your rules, Karen," Jessica said, her tone firm, "but Sophia is not breaking any laws. She's just a child." Karen's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a small, tight smile. "If you can't control her, I'll have to get involved. The HOA doesn't tolerate disruptions." Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. Karen wasn't just a concerned neighbor anymore. She was something far worse. A control freak who thought she had the right to dictate their lives. "This has gone too far," Jessica muttered, but Karen had already turned her back, leaving her standing in the yard with Sophia, the weight of Karen's words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. As Karen walked back toward her house, Jessica looked down at Sophia, her heart breaking. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse from here. Something in Karen had snapped, and Jessica wasn't sure how much longer they could escape her grasp. It was an unusually warm afternoon, and the neighborhood was quiet, save for the occasional chirping of birds and the sound of children's laughter. Jessica had just finished making lunch when she heard the unmistakable sound of raised voices outside. She stood by the kitchen window, wiping her hands on a dish towel, peering out at Sophia and a few other kids playing near the edge of their property. They were kicking a ball back and forth, running around, the kind of innocent play that every child should enjoy. But then, she saw it, the tall figure of Karen Blackwell, storming down the sidewalk toward them, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. The kids scattered the moment they saw her approach, but Sophia remained where she was, kicking the ball back to one of the other children. It was then that Jessica noticed Karen's expression, a mixture of irritation and condescension. The confrontation began slowly at first, but Jessica's stomach turned as she watched Karen march up to Sophia, her voice cutting through the air. "Sophia," Karen called out sharply, her eyes narrowed with accusation. "You're violating the HOA rules again." Sophia looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I'm just playing with my friends." "You're too close to the property line." Karen snapped, her voice rising with anger. "I've told you before, stay within the boundaries of your own yard. The HOA is very clear about this." Jessica's blood ran cold. She had seen Karen become controlling over the years, but this was ridiculous. There was no HOA rule against playing near a property line, at least, not one that had ever been mentioned to them. But Karen wasn't listening. She was fixated on Sophia, her voice growing more shrill with every word. Sophia stood still for a moment, trying to process what was happening. Her face flushed with frustration and confusion, she took a step back. "I wasn't even near your yard," Sophia said, her voice shaky but defiant. "It's not a big deal. We're just kids playing. You need to learn some respect." Karen hissed, her words coming out with an almost venomous edge. "I'm trying to keep order here, and you don't get to ignore the rules just because you think you're above them." The exchange had become uncomfortable for the other children, and they had already scattered, leaving Sophia standing alone with Karen. Jessica watched from the window, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew Karen had been getting more aggressive in her attempts to control the neighborhood, but she never expected it would come to this. Sophia was just a kid. Feeling a surge of panic, Sophia stepped back again, but Karen followed her, stepping into her personal space. "I said stay within the boundaries," Karen snarled, her eyes flashing with frustration. Sophia's body stiffened, and instinctively, she grabbed a small kitchen knife she had been holding earlier, used for helping to trim some plants. She didn't raise it as a weapon, but rather as a barrier between herself and Karen, who was getting too close. "Back off, Karen!" Sophia cried, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't want any trouble. Just leave me alone." But Karen saw the knife in Sophia's hand, her eyes widening with a sudden fear. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, then, in a panic, Karen acted. In the split second after Sophia raised the knife, Karen's mind jumped to conclusions. She saw the glint of the steel, the defensive posture, and assumed the worst. "You're threatening me!" Karen screamed, her voice cracking with panic. "Stay back. I'll protect myself." Before Sophia could say another word, Karen's hand shot to her waist, pulling out a small handgun from her purse. The weapon seemed out of place, a sudden, violent response to what was, in reality, a scared child simply trying to defend herself from an overbearing adult. Sophia froze, her heart racing as Karen pointed the gun directly at her. "Karen, no!" Sophia shouted, her voice filled with terror. "I'm not going to hurt you. Before Sophia could finish, Karen's finger tightened on the trigger, and the gunshot rang out like thunder, echoing through the otherwise quiet neighborhood. The bullet struck Sophia's shoulder with a sickening thud, and she collapsed to the ground, a scream escaping her lips. The air seemed to stop, and for a moment, everything was eerily quiet. Karen stood frozen, her eyes wide, the gun still aimed at the ground. She trembled, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. She had shot a child, a neighbor's child. But all she could focus on was her own fear, her own panic. Oh my God," Karen muttered, her voice shaking as she stumbled back, still holding the gun. "What have I done?" Jessica heard the gunshot from the kitchen, and her heart stopped. She didn't think, she just ran. Her legs carried her outside, and when she saw Sophia lying on the ground, blood pooling beneath her, everything else faded from her mind. "Sophia!" Jessica screamed, her voice cracking. She dropped to her knees beside her daughter, her hands trembling as she touched Sophia's bleeding shoulder. Sophia was conscious, but her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with shock. "Mom, it hurts," she whimpered, tears streaking down her face. Jessica's hands moved quickly, trying to apply pressure to the wound. "Stay with me, sweetie. Stay with me, okay?" Behind her, Karen was still standing there, her hands shaking as she clutched the gun. Her face was a mask of disbelief, her eyes frantic. I didn't mean to." She had the knife. "I thought she was going to hurt me," her words tumbled out in a jumbled mess, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore except Sophia's life. "Karen!" Jessica shouted, turning her head with a wild look in her eyes. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Karen dropped the gun, her knees buckling beneath her. "I was just protecting myself," she muttered over and over, her voice hoarse. "I had no choice," but Jessica wasn't listening. She couldn't. She was too focused on Sophia, who was slipping in and out of consciousness. The blood didn't stop flowing, and Jessica's hands felt like they were drowning in it. "Someone help!" Jessica screamed, looking desperately around the yard. Her mind raced, thoughts spinning, but her focus never wavered from her daughter. Minutes felt like hours before Daniel arrived, running from the house at full speed. His eyes went wide as he saw Sophia on the ground, but there was no time for words. "I called 911, Daniel said, his voice tight with fear. He dropped to his knees beside Jessica, immediately helping to apply pressure to the wound. "We need to get her to the hospital, now." The sirens could already be heard in the distance, but for now, all Jessica could do was hold her daughter close, praying that it wasn't too late. The minutes felt like hours as Jessica gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, her eyes fixed on the road, the harsh glow of the streetlights cutting through the darkness. Beside her, Sophia's small body shuddered in the passenger seat, her face pale, eyes fluttering open and closed, as if trying to hold on to consciousness but failing. "Stay with me, sweetheart," Jessica whispered, her voice trembling with fear as she glanced over at Sophia. The blood from her shoulder wound was soaking through the makeshift bandage Jessica had wrapped around it, and every time she looked over at her daughter, it felt like the world was closing in around them. Sophia didn't respond. She just lay there, her breathing shallow, her eyelids flickering as if caught between reality and darkness. The weight of the situation pressed down on Jessica. The terror of what had happened, the guilt for not being able to protect Sophia, the overwhelming sense of helplessness, she couldn't handle it all at once. But she had to. She had to keep moving. There was no time to think about anything except getting Sophia the help she needed. "Please, God," Jessica muttered, her voice cracking as she drove faster, her eyes scanning the road ahead, looking for any sign of the hospital. Sophia's body trembled more with each passing moment, and Jessica feared that every second wasted was a second too late. Her thoughts kept racing, replaying the events in her mind, the confrontation with Karen, the sound of the gunshot, Sophia falling to the ground, her cries for help. The hospital was finally in sight. Jessica's heart leaped with a mix of relief and terror. She had made it, but Sophia's life was still hanging by a thread. Karen's words echoed in Jessica's mind, "She threatened me. She had a knife." It didn't matter anymore. The woman had pulled the trigger. Sophia had been trying to defend herself, but no one could hear her side. Not yet. The car screeched to a stop at the emergency entrance. Jessica jumped out, leaving the engine running, and rushed around to the passenger side to pull Sophia out of the car. She wasn't sure how long it would take for them to get help, but she didn't have time to waste. "Help! My daughter's been shot!" Jessica screamed as she ran toward the entrance, holding Sophia in her arms. Nurses and doctors rushed to her side, quickly taking Sophia from Jessica's arms and into the hospital. She could barely keep up, her legs feeling like they were moving through quicksand. She was almost there, but it still felt like she was losing her daughter all over again. By the time Sophia had been rushed into surgery, the sirens of the police arrived at the scene. Daniel had stayed behind to manage the chaos, trying to speak to the neighbors who had gathered outside, all of them whispering in groups, casting strange glances at him. It was clear the situation was quickly dividing the neighborhood. Some were sympathetic, some were indifferent, and others were already making excuses for Karen. As the officers approached, Karen was already standing by the curb, her posture stiff and defensive. She was still visibly shaken, her hand clutching her purse like a lifeline, but her eyes were steely. She had already started weaving her story. "I was just protecting myself," she repeated, over and over. "The girl threatened me. She had a knife. I didn't have a choice." Daniel couldn't hold back the anger anymore. He stepped forward, his voice low but seething with fury. "You shot my daughter. And you're standing there acting like it was just an accident? You had a choice, Karen. You could have backed off. You didn't need to shoot her." Karen turned toward him, her expression hardening. "She was a threat. You don't understand. I was just trying to defend myself." Daniel clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. "You don't shoot a child to defend yourself. You don't shoot anyone unless you're trying to kill them." The police officers stepped in between them, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Sir, please," one of the officers said. "We need to hear both sides. We'll take your statements and investigate." But Karen wasn't finished. "I was just trying to keep order," she shouted, her voice cracking as she grew more frantic. "This neighborhood needs to follow the rules." She was violating them. "I don't want anyone to get hurt, but I couldn't let it go on any longer. She had a knife," She was coming at me. The officer turned to Daniel, his face sympathetic but professional. We need to gather statements. If you'd like to speak with the detective, we'll get you in touch once we've processed the scene. By the time Jessica had returned from the hospital, her heart heavy with worry, the investigation was in full swing. The detectives were questioning the neighbors, taking down their statements about the confrontation. Jessica could feel the tension in the air, thick with conflicting versions of what had happened. The officers had taken Karen's statement first, and she had stuck to her story. Sophia had been threatening her with a knife, and she had acted out of fear. She even had her own witness, Clara, the neighbor across the street, who had seen Sophia wielding the knife. But Jessica knew what had really happened. Sophia hadn't threatened anyone. She had raised the knife out of fear, trying to protect herself when Karen had gotten too close, too aggressive. But Karen had already begun spinning the narrative to make herself the victim. And with the weight of her position as HOA president, she had already begun to garner support from some of the more impressionable neighbors. The police were thorough, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that they were being influenced by Karen's manipulations. The evidence didn't add up. No one had seen Sophia attack Karen, all the witnesses had arrived after the shot was fired. And Sophia, poor, frightened Sophia, was too sedated and traumatized to explain herself. As Jessica sat in the living room, waiting for the phone call from the hospital, she thought back to everything that had led up to that moment. How had it gotten this far? How had Karen become so unhinged that she'd pulled a gun on a child? The answers weren't clear yet, but one thing was, this wasn't just an accident. This was a calculated act. Karen had made a decision, and Sophia had paid the price. As the night wore on, the police finished their questioning and promised Jessica they would keep her updated. But the pain of knowing that Karen was still out there, still manipulating the story, gnawed at her. She wouldn't let Karen get away with it. Not this time. Jessica clutched the phone tightly, waiting for news from the hospital. And as the seconds ticked by, she steeled herself for the battle ahead. Because if Karen thought she could get away with this, she had another thing coming. Days after the shooting, the weight of the situation began to sink in. Sophia was still recovering in the hospital, her body bruised and battered, but the emotional toll was even worse. Jessica stayed by her side, but the silence between mother and daughter was deafening. The once lively, rebellious child who had played soccer with friends and talked about her dreams of traveling had been replaced by a quiet, withdrawn version who flinched at every loud noise. Sophia had already been through so much in such a short amount of time, and the family was left to pick up the pieces. But the physical recovery was just one part of the battle. The real war had only just begun. Jessica knew they had to fight for justice, not just for their daughter, but for the truth. Jessica and Daniel spent the next few days gathering information, trying to piece together the legal steps that would need to be taken to hold Karen accountable. It wasn't easy. They had to face a slow, frustrating legal process, one that felt as if the system itself was stacked against them. With Karen being the HOA president, she had connections in the community that made things complicated. The lawyers they spoke to were polite but cautious, their words laced with doubt. The laws are tricky when it comes to self-defense claims, especially with someone like Karen, one attorney had told them. Her position in the community might influence the outcome. If she can prove she was in fear for her life, the charges might be hard to press. Jessica's stomach twisted. Karen had already manipulated the narrative, painting herself as the victim of a teenage girl's aggression. The idea that she might get away with shooting Sophia because of her community position made Jessica's blood boil. Still, she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when Sophia was fighting for her life, both physically and emotionally. I won't stop, Jessica had promised herself. She knew it wasn't just about the legal battle. It was about taking back control, about holding Karen accountable for the chaos she had caused. But as days turned into weeks, the legal process moved slowly, painfully slow. Witnesses were interviewed, but Karen's supporters, those who believed she was justified in her actions, seemed to outnumber those willing to stand by the Carters. The uncertainty weighed heavily on them. Was justice truly on their side, or was the system going to fail them like so many others before? As the days wore on, the neighborhood began to fracture. The once tight-knit community Jessica had hoped to be a part of was now divided, with neighbors taking sides. Some stood behind Karen, defending her right to self-defense, citing her role as the HOA president and her long-standing position in the community. They believed Karen had acted out of fear, that she had been backed into a corner by an aggressive teenager. These neighbors saw Sophia as the troublemaker, a symbol of the chaos that had crept into the neighborhood. To them, Karen was just doing her duty to protect their way of life. Others saw the truth more clearly. They saw a woman who had overstepped her bounds, someone who had gone from the self-righteous enforcer of petty rules to a woman capable of shooting an innocent child in cold blood. These neighbors rallied behind Jessica and Sophia, offering support, but the damage had already been done. Jessica felt like an outsider in her own home. And then there were the in-betweeners, those who didn't want to get involved, who hoped the situation would blow over and return to normal. But it never did. Every trip to the mailbox, every walk down the sidewalk, felt like an emotional gauntlet. Jessica and Sophia had to face whispers and stares, their every move under scrutiny, while Karen remained the seemingly untouchable figure at the heart of the neighborhood. Sophia felt it most. Every day she spent in bed, recovering from her wound, her mind replaying the traumatic events, the questions about whether she was the one to blame. Her self-doubt grew in tandem with the neighborhood split. Was she really the victim here, or was she just another rebellious teenager who had pushed too far? Jessica saw her daughter retreat further into herself, becoming quieter and more withdrawn. No amount of comforting seemed to ease the hurt. They had lost more than just a sense of safety, they had lost a part of their lives in that moment. The battle for justice was now a battle for their very identities. Jessica spent sleepless nights trying to find some way to make Karen face the consequences, but it was hard to feel hopeful when the world around them seemed to be turning against them. Just when Jessica was beginning to lose hope, a breakthrough came, a single piece of evidence that could change everything. It happened by chance. Sophia, trying to distract herself from the pain of recovery, had started going through the old neighborhood Facebook group page. She hadn't even planned on looking for anything specific, but something caught her eye, a post from a neighbor who had been there when the confrontation with Karen occurred. The post had been written the day after the shooting, but it was clear this neighbor had been one of the few to see everything unfold. "I was walking my dog that afternoon and saw Karen confront the girl. She had the knife in her hand, but it was clear she wasn't attacking. Karen stepped too close, and the girl was trying to back away. I'm not sure what happened, but I saw Karen pull a gun and shoot. It wasn't self-defense. It looked like she just snapped." The post was short, but it was enough. Sophia showed Jessica the post, her hands shaking. Jessica immediately contacted the neighbor, who agreed to give a statement. The breakthrough was monumental. The neighbor's testimony could be the key to proving Karen had lied. Jessica's heart raced as she contacted the police and the lawyer. This was the evidence they needed. The neighborhood was divided, but this piece of truth could make all the difference. With the new witness statement, the momentum in the case shifted in their favor. Karen's carefully crafted narrative was starting to fall apart, and Jessica finally felt like there was a glimmer of hope. But she knew the battle wasn't over. The neighborhood had already chosen sides, and Karen would fight to keep her power and position intact. There was still much work to be done, but for the first time in weeks, Jessica had a sense that justice could prevail. The wheels of justice, slow as they were finally turning in the right direction. But the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. Still, one thing was clear: Jessica wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The tension in the air at the monthly HOA meeting was palpable. Jessica could feel it in her chest, a heavy weight that made her every breath feel labored. Tonight was supposed to be just another routine meeting, nothing more than the usual complaints and discussions about lawn care, parking rules, and trivial neighborhood grievances. But for Jessica, this night was everything. She had prepared for this moment. Sophia's recovery had taken a toll on the entire family, but they had gathered the evidence they needed to confront Karen once and for all. The witness statement from the neighbor who had seen everything, the neighbor who had confirmed Karen was the one who had escalated the situation, who had pulled the gun and fired it in cold blood. The weight of that truth had given Jessica the strength she needed. The time for silence had passed. Tonight, she would make sure Karen was held accountable. Jessica and Daniel walked into the meeting room together, their presence unnoticed at first by the usual crowd of neighbors sitting in folding chairs. But as Jessica stepped forward, the room seemed to still. Eyes shifted toward her, and whispers began to spread. Karen was sitting at the front of the room, as she always did, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the crowd with an air of superiority. But when she saw Jessica, something flickered in her eyes, a brief moment of recognition, then a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Jessica knew what that smile meant. It was a mask, and she had no intention of letting it remain intact. She stepped to the front, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "I have something to say," Jessica began, her eyes locking onto Karen's. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened, the pain, the fear, the helplessness. "I'm here tonight to confront the person who almost killed my daughter." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Karen's eyes narrowed, her shoulders tensing. She hadn't expected Jessica to come armed with more than just her anger. "Karen Blackwell," Jessica continued, her voice growing stronger. "You shot my daughter, Sophia, on the false belief that she was threatening you. You pulled a gun on a child because you were too scared of losing control. But that's not what happened. You shot her because you're a coward, and you saw a chance to take someone down." Karen shot to her feet, her hands shaking. "That's a lie," she spat, her voice rising with panic. "She was coming at me with a knife. I had to protect myself." Jessica's resolve only hardened. "We have the evidence, Karen," she said, her eyes never leaving Karen's face. "Witnesses who saw you pull the gun. Neighbors who heard Sophia scream. And the police report. Sophia wasn't the one who escalated the situation, you did." The room fell silent. Karen's face twisted with rage, her eyes flicking to the crowd, seeking some sign of support. But it wasn't there. Slowly, the weight of Jessica's words began to sink in. Karen tried to regain her composure, but Jessica saw the cracks start to show. She was no longer in control. I was just doing what I thought was right." Karen stammered, her voice wavering as the facade crumbled. "I had to make sure everyone was safe. You don't understand. She was threatening me. She had the knife, she was going to hurt me." "You don't get to twist the truth anymore, Karen," Jessica shot back. "The only one threatening anyone was you. You shot my daughter. You tried to kill her, and I won't let you get away with it." The crowd was silent now, every eye on Karen, and the realization was sinking in that Karen had been lying all along. The rest of the meeting was a blur. Some neighbors had already started to speak up, some in hushed whispers, others with rising voices. "I knew there was something off about her," one neighbor muttered, glancing over at Karen with disbelief. "She always had a way of making people uncomfortable." "Karen has always been controlling," another neighbor added, her voice soft but firm. "But I didn't know she'd go that far." Jessica felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it was fleeting. The damage had already been done. While some neighbors were now beginning to see the truth, others, those who had blindly followed Karen, looked away or shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had already chosen their side, and now it was too late to take it back. As the meeting disbanded, a few neighbors approached Jessica. Terry, who had lived across the street, gave her a tentative smile. "I'm so sorry this happened," she said quietly. "If I had known, I would have spoken up sooner." Thank you, Jessica replied, her voice heavy with exhaustion. I just don't understand how Karen could do this. Sophia was just a kid. I know, Terry said, shaking her head. We've all seen the way she's acted. But we didn't know it was this bad. I'm so sorry. The apology was a small comfort, but Jessica couldn't shake the anger that was still building in her chest. Karen had tried to destroy her family, and while some neighbors were coming forward now, it didn't erase the harm that had already been done. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with tension, and Jessica sat at the front, her heart pounding as she looked at Karen sitting across the room, her face composed and tight with anger. The prosecution had presented its case. Karen had shot Sophia in a moment of fear, but that fear was based on a lie. The defense, as expected, claimed that Karen had acted in self-defense, that she had no choice but to protect herself from the teenager with a knife. But now, with the witness statements and the evidence from the neighborhood, the truth was beginning to break through. Sophia was called to the stand next. She had been nervous about speaking in front of the courtroom, but Jessica had encouraged her, telling her that this was her chance to make the world hear her side of the story. As Sophia took the stand, Jessica couldn't help but feel proud of her daughter. Despite everything she had been through, despite the trauma of being shot, Sophia was standing tall. She was telling the truth. She wasn't a victim of Karen's lies anymore. I didn't mean to hurt her, Sophia said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I was just trying to protect myself. I didn't even know she had a gun. I didn't want any of this to happen. The room was silent as Sophia spoke. Karen's face was stone cold, but Jessica could see the cracks forming. Her defense was failing. The truth was too strong to be denied. In the end, the judge delivered his verdict. Karen was found guilty of aggravated assault for shooting Sophia. The legal battle had come to a close, but the damage was already done. Karen might not face jail time, there was still room for a plea agreement, but the conviction meant that her actions would be on record. She would never again be the uncontested voice of authority in the neighborhood. As the verdict was read, Jessica let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. She had fought for Sophia, for the truth, and now they had won. The weeks following the trial were a blur. The adrenaline of fighting for justice had worn off, replaced by an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. Jessica and Daniel found themselves on autopilot, going through the motions of their day-to-day lives, while still carrying the emotional weight of everything they had endured. Sophia had been released from the hospital, but her recovery was far from over. Her body was healing, the physical wounds slowly fading, but the emotional scars were another matter entirely. She had grown quieter, withdrawn into herself as if trying to escape the trauma that had shattered her once bright spirit. Her playful nature was replaced with hesitation. The confidence she once had in her voice was now replaced by a soft uncertainty. Jessica did everything she could to comfort her daughter, but there were days when she didn't know how. She would sit beside Sophia in the evenings, talking to her about everything and nothing, hoping to bridge the gap that had formed between them. Daniel, too, tried to be the steady presence Sophia needed. They both encouraged her to be open, to talk about her feelings, but Sophia would often retreat into silence. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, there were small signs of progress. Sophia would smile more, even if it was just for a moment. She started to draw again, something she had stopped doing in the aftermath of the shooting. Jessica had been hesitant to bring it up at first, unsure if Sophia was ready to confront the darkness that had taken root in her mind. But one evening, she found Sophia sitting at the kitchen table, her sketchbook open in front of her. "What are you drawing, sweetie?" Jessica asked, her voice soft. Sophia looked up, her face still carrying the weight of everything she had been through, but there was a flicker of something, hope. "I'm drawing something new," Sophia said, her voice quiet but steady. Jessica leaned over to take a look. The drawing was of a tree, its branches wide and stretching across the page, reaching for the light. The sky behind it was soft and warm, painted with hues of yellow and orange. "It's beautiful," Jessica said, her heart swelling with relief. "I'm proud of you." For the first time in weeks, Sophia smiled, truly smiled, as if the weight of her trauma had lifted just a little. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Jessica hope that they were all starting to heal. As the days passed, the decision to leave the neighborhood became inevitable. The house they had once called home now felt like a reminder of everything that had happened: the constant surveillance of Karen, the shooting, the division of the community. It was no longer a place of comfort but a place filled with painful memories. Jessica and Daniel sat down one evening, the weight of their conversation heavy in the air. "I don't think we can stay here anymore," Jessica said, her voice low. "Every corner reminds me of what happened. Every time we go outside, I feel like we're being watched." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. "I know. I thought we could put it behind us, but every time I look out the window, I remember the way Karen looked at us, the way she tried to justify what she did. It's like we're living in a place that doesn't want us to move on." They both knew what they had to do. It wasn't easy. Leaving behind their home, their neighbors, the life they had tried to build, it felt like giving up. But they realized that they couldn't keep living in a place that would never truly be a safe space for their family again. A few weeks later, they found a small house in a quiet town several hours away from the one that had brought them so much pain. It was modest, tucked away in a neighborhood where people were friendly but not intrusive, where the streets were quiet and the air felt lighter. The move was hard. There were boxes to pack, memories to sort through, and the emotional strain of leaving behind everything they had once known. But as they settled into their new home, Jessica realized that, for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. It wasn't complete, but it was the beginning of a new chapter. The new house was quiet at first, the walls echoing with the sound of silence. But it didn't take long before the Carter family started to feel the shift. They started to build new routines, finding comfort in their fresh start. Sophia found her voice again, though it was quieter than before. She spent more time outside, exploring the yard, enjoying the space she had longed for. The old neighborhood had suffocated her, but here, in the open air, she began to rediscover herself. One afternoon, she came running inside with a big smile on her face. "Look, Mom. I found a huge tree in the backyard," she exclaimed. "It's perfect for climbing." Jessica smiled, her heart lifting. "I'm glad you're enjoying it, sweetheart," she said, pulling Sophia into a hug. The biggest change, however, came in Sophia's art. Over the next few weeks, the pages in her sketchbook filled with new drawings, each one more vibrant and full of life than the last. She drew animals, trees, colorful sunsets. Each picture told a story of recovery, of reclaiming her childhood, of finding her way out of the darkness. One evening, as Jessica sat beside her, watching Sophia draw, she noticed something different in her daughter's expression. Sophia was smiling, really smiling, as she added the final touches to a picture of a bright sun shining over a field of flowers. "Look, Mom," Sophia said, holding up the page. "It's a new beginning. Just like us." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't the life they had planned, and it hadn't been an easy journey, but they had made it through. Together. And that was enough. In that quiet moment, Jessica knew that while the past would always be a part of them, it no longer had the power to define them. They were moving forward, one step at a time, toward a future that was bright and full of promise. As the sun set over their new home, Sophia put down her pencil and leaned back, looking out the window. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel weighed down by the past. She felt free. And for Jessica, that was all that mattered.